Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. This is full of divine consciousness. From the fullness, fullness emerges. Even after removing fullness from fullness, what remains is divine peace, 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 peace. Welcome to the God. And the second mantra reconciles the apparent opposites between acting in the world and remaining in a kind of spiritual poise. And if any of you have studied the Bhagavad Gita, you'll find this is one of the keynotes of the Bhagavad Gita. In one shloka, for instance, Bhagavan Krishna says, Nyeha sanitya sannyasi yona dveshti na kangshati. The true sannyasi is not the one who renounces the world and wears the skeruva and all that. It's the person who is completely free from inner desires, cravings for worldly pleasures, and who is free from dvesha, also aversion to worldly things. Which means it's spirituality is an internal state, ultimately. So it's perfectly compatible. Spirituality is perfectly compatible with action in the world. That's why the second mantra says, Kurvan neveha karmani jivishe chatagga samaha. You should strive to live for 100 years, working for the welfare of the world. So that's a very brief summary. Today, so we've discussed the first and second mantras. And since this is the last class, I won't be able to cover the remaining 16 mantras, unfortunately, maybe in the future sometime. Today I'm going to attempt to discuss mantra 7, mantras 9 to 11, which come as a kind of triad. They're linked to each other. And the final mantra, mantra 18. So let's try to do that, and then I'd love to hear from you, and I can take your questions. So let's dive into it. Let's look first at mantra 7. And as we did in the previous classes, I'll repeat the Sanskrit first, quarter by quarter, and then you can repeat, please. Yasmin sarvani bhutani atmaiva bhut vijanataha tatra ko mohakka shoka ekatvam anupashyataha. So this is Sri Aurobindo's translation of the seventh mantra. He in whom it is the self-being that has become all existences that are becomings. For he has the perfect knowledge. How shall he be deluded? Whence shall he have grief who sees everywhere oneness? Let's begin with Shankara's interpretation. And this is on the handout. So according to Shankara, what this mantra is saying is that the Advaita Jnani, the one who practices Jnana Yoga in Shankara's tradition, that Jnani has the spiritual realization that all beings are nothing but the non-dual Atman, in a very specific sense, in the sense that the only reality is the non-dual Atman, and all names and forms, nama-rupa, are ultimately non-existent. They exist from the empirical standpoint, the Vyavaharika standpoint, but from the ultimate standpoint, the only reality is non-dual Brahman. This is how he interprets this mantra, and this really striking word ekatvam in the second line, tatra ko moha kashoka ekatvam anupashyataha. Oneness. He interprets this as Atma Ekatvam, the oneness of the Atman. Keep this in mind as we compare his interpretation with Swami Vivekananda's and Sri Aurobindo's. So it seems that he does so partly because he's always in dialogue with other schools, philosophical schools, and one of the ones he had in mind was Sankhya. And according to Sankhya philosophy, there isn't one Atman, there are many Atmans. It's called the Bahupurushavada, the doctrine of many Purushas. You have one Purusha, I have a different Purusha, we all have different Purushas, different Atmas. Shankara says that's wrong. There's only one Atman ultimately. So it's possible that when he emphasizes that this mantra is teaching us Atma Ekatvam, the oneness of the Atman, he's claiming that the Upanishads don't support the Sankhyan view that there are multiple Atmans. That's just a suggestion. But now, let's explore whether there's a different way of interpreting the same mantra if we think about the mantra from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. First, let's start with something Sri Ramakrishna taught. He explains the Vijnani's realization of oneness as follows. The bhakta, the devotee of the personal God, also has a realization of oneness. He sees that there's nothing but God. Instead of saying that the world is unreal like a dream, he says that God has become everything. In a wax garden, everything is wax, but in various forms. This is a very beautiful statement. I'm going to read the original Bangla for those of you who can appreciate it. Bhaktaro ekakar gyan hoy. Ekakar gyan, realization of oneness. She dekhe Ishwar chhara ar kichui nei. Shopnobot bole na, tobe bole tini shob hoyechen. Momer bagane shobi mom, tobe nana roop. In this passage, it's a very important passage, Sri Ramakrishna contrasts two different kinds of Advaitic realization and two different kinds of Advaitic philosophy. The first kind he has in mind is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. The only reality is non-dual Brahman. This world is unreal like a dream. He says it explicitly, Shopnabad. Everything is like a dream. But the bhakta, he says, and here he has in mind the Vijnani bhakta, the one who's attained that Brahma-jnana and then goes further and sees that it is Brahman that has become the 24 cosmic principle. Brahman has become everything in this universe. What is it like? So this is what I call Vijnana Vedanta in my own work. He uses this really striking analogy, the analogy of wax. You know, we have Madame Tussauds, right, in England and other places. So it's like that. You walk in and it seems like everything is lifelike, but everything is actually made of wax. Similarly, the Vijnani sees everything as God, everything as Brahman. But then he says, Tobe nana roop. But that same wax, i.e. Brahman, God, actually takes many different forms, manifests in various forms. It manifests as a pews, it manifests as each human being. It manifests as the doors and the windows and the tables and the laptops. The names and forms themselves are real manifestations of God. And this is what the wax metaphor illustrates. If any of you are familiar with some of the other Upanishads, this should remind us of the analogies used in Chandogya Upanishad in a famous passage, 6.1, mantras 4 through 5, where the Upanishad tries to explain the relationship between Brahman and this universe, the Jagat. And it uses several metaphors, but the most famous ones are, it likens Brahman to clay, and this world too, and everything in the world to pots, differently shaped pots, and different pots of different shapes and different sizes. The other metaphor it uses is it likens Brahman to gold, and the various ornaments you can make from this gold, like earrings or necklaces or whatever, as all the different golden ornaments, the different forms of gold. And in the same way, Sri Ramakrishna says, there's nothing but wax, which means there's nothing but God in this world. But the different formations of the wax, the different forms that Brahman takes in this world are perfectly real. And the other thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that Sri Ramakrishna, like the Isha Upanishad 7th mantra, which uses the word ekatvam, oneness, Sri Ramakrishna also says, it's not that the Vijnani is not an Advaitin, the Vijnani is an Advaitin. He sees oneness. And what he sees is that, what he realizes is that there's only one reality, and that's God. And that God playfully manifests as everything in this world, everything and everyone in the world, right? So it's a different kind of oneness. According to Shankara, the oneness is the oneness of the Atman. There aren't multiple Atmans, there's only one Atman. Sri Ramakrishna says the Vijnani sees the oneness of everything in this world. Everything is God in different forms. So keep this in mind as we move forward and we look at how Swami Vivekananda interprets this mantra and then how Sri Aurobindo interprets the mantra. Now, let's start with Swami Vivekananda. So this is from that same lecture we've been talking about in previous classes, God in Everything, delivered in 1896. It's an extended interpretation and commentary on the Isha Upanishad. This is what he says. Swami Vivekananda says, when all life and the whole universe are seen in this Atman, then alone man has attained the secret. There is no more delusion for him. Where is any more misery for him who sees this oneness in the universe? This is another great theme of the Vedanta, this oneness of life, this oneness of everything. If you go below the surface, you find that unity between man and man, between races and races, high and low, rich and poor, gods and men and animals. If you go deep enough, all will be seen as only variations of the one. And he who has attained to this conception of oneness has no more delusion. What can delude him? This is an almost direct translation of the 7th mantra of the Isha Upanishad. But notice the differences here. Notice, especially in the bold, first of all, he's not following Shankara and understanding the ekatvam, the oneness mentioned in the 7th mantra, this realization of oneness, as the realization of the oneness of the Atman, Atma ekatvam. It's realizing the oneness of everything. He says the oneness of life, this oneness of everything. Just like Sri Ramakrishna, and the Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnani, who sees everything as God, right? And Swami Vivekananda says even more explicitly and carefully, all will be seen as only variations of the one. You see, that means the variations are not unreal. They're not dismissed as a dream. They're real variations of that one reality, which is God. So now we can come to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, which is very much in line with the approach of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. First of all, let's go. So as I said, the translation that we read at the beginning is Sri Aurobindo's translation. So notice his translation of a key word. It's the last word of the first line of the 7th mantra. So, Yasmin sarvani bhutani atmaiva bhut vijanataha. This word vijanataha. It's a very significant word for Sri Aurobindo. This is the participle form of the word vijnana. And this is not controversial, it's just Sanskrit. So vijnana is a noun form of the same word. Vijanataha means, so that's why he's rendering this as he has the perfect knowledge, or having the perfect knowledge would be even more, that would be the participle. Participle just means the ing form of a word. So having the perfect knowledge, what is perfect knowledge? It's vijnana. So here, Sri Aurobindo is explicitly explaining this idea of vijnana, this vijnani's realization of oneness in everything. He's understanding this in Sri Ramakrishna's sense. And this is very significant. He does this again in his essays on the Gita. In the Bhagavad Gita, this is something I discuss in a separate scholarly article. There are a number of places where the Bhagavad Gita distinguishes jnana from vijnana. And it's a very cryptic distinction, and different commentators have understood the distinction between jnana and vijnana in different ways. Sri Aurobindo interprets jnana along the lines of Sri Ramakrishna's jnana, which is a realization of the impersonal, non-dual Brahman. And vijnana as Sri Ramakrishna's vijnana, which is the realization of God in everything and as everything. So I'm just flagging that this is a very important place where Sri Aurobindo is explicitly claiming that the term vijanataha should be understood as having vijnana, and he explains vijnana in terms of Sri Ramakrishna's idea of vijnana. Also like Sri Ramakrishna, remember the quotation I just read from Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel, the Kathamrita. He says, he contrasts two different kinds of Advaita. There's Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, which is Shankara's classical Advaita. And then there's Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, which is Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. It's the Vijnani's realization. That there's only God. In this world is also a real manifestation of that same God. Sri Aurobindo says exactly the same thing. And he's claiming that the 7th mantra supports this life-affirming and world-affirming Advaita. He says the following, this is in the handout. According to Sri Aurobindo, the Isha Upanishad teaches what he calls a comprehensive Advaita rather than an illusionist Advaita. He says the Isha Upanishad does not teach a pure and exclusive monism. It declares the one without denying the many, and its method is to see the one in the many. The ensemble of these ideas is consistent only with a synthetic or comprehensive, as opposed to an illusionist or exclusive monism. So this is somewhat technical and somewhat challenging language, but he's saying, as far as I can tell, almost exactly the same thing that Sri Ramakrishna is saying. He's saying that in this mantra, it's teaching oneness, it's teaching Advaita, but it's a synthetic Advaita, it's a comprehensive Advaita, which encompasses this entire world, and encompasses the personal God, and encompasses all the individual souls dwelling in this world. That means everything is part of that Advaitic totality. As opposed to what he calls the exclusive monism, the exclusive Advaita of classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara school. Why is it exclusive? Because it's affirming the ultimate reality only of Brahman and dismissing everything else as ultimately non-existent. Jiva, Jagat, Ishvara. The individual souls are not ultimately existent. This universe of names and forms is ultimately non-existent. The personal God, even, is ultimately non-existent. Sri Ramakrishna says, and Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda say, no, that's all part of that Advaitic totality. Sri Ramakrishna used to say in Bangla, Shab jodiye ekti. Everything is one, but don't think that it's a one that excludes anything. The one encompasses everything. Shab jodiye ekti. This is, in the case of Sri Ramakrishna, I call his philosophy Vijnana Vedanta. In my new book on Swami Vivekananda's philosophy, I refer to his philosophy as integral Advaita. And this is exactly what I mean by integral Advaita. It's an Advaita that doesn't exclude anything. It accepts the reality of this world. It accepts the reality of the personal God. So that's mantra 7. Now let's look at mantras 9, 10, and 11, which form a triad. They go together. So what I suggest we do is read them together, first in Sanskrit and then Sri Aurobindo's translation. Andham tamaf pravishanti ye vidyam upasate tato bhuya ivate tamo ya uvidyaya agrataha. Okay, one note, if you guys are a little confused, if you don't know Sanskrit, the first line of this mantra says, Ye vidyam upasate. It's actually avidyam. It's not a typo. It's Sanskrit. So there's a comma there, which means that a letter has been dropped. What's been dropped is the ah. So it's actually ye avidyam upasate, but because of what's called sandhi, euphonious word combination, that gets dropped. But it's actually avidya. So that's important to keep in mind for what follows. So this, okay, let's continue with the Sanskrit first, then I'll read all the Sri Aurobindo's English together. So 10. Anya devahur vidyaya Anya dahura vidyaya Iti shushrumadhiranam Yenastadvichachakshire Vidyancha vidyancha Yastadvedo bhayam saha Avidyaya mrityum titva Vidyayamritam. Here is Sri Aurobindo's translation. 9. Into a blind darkness they enter, who follow after the ignorance. They, as if into a greater darkness, who devote themselves to the knowledge alone. 10. Other, verily, it is said, is that which comes by the knowledge. Other, that which comes by the ignorance. This is the lore we have received from the wise who revealed that to our understanding. And 11. He who knows that as both in one, the knowledge and the ignorance, by the ignorance crosses beyond death, and by the knowledge enjoys immortality. These are some of the most baffling mantras in the entire Upanishadic corpus, not just the Isha Upanishad, but across all the Upanishads. Why? Why are they so cryptic? Why are they so difficult to decipher? For two main reasons, as far as I can tell. First reason, in general, in the Upanishads, vidya is a very, very good thing. In fact, it's the highest goal of life. Vidya means knowledge. Knowledge of what? Knowledge of Brahman, knowledge of the ultimate reality. It's supposed to be salvation, nothing short of salvation. Here, strangely, the Upanishad is saying, so those who worship avidya, we understand. Avidya means ignorance. Those who worship ignorance go into darkness. Great, no problem. Those who worship vidya lead as if into a greater darkness. So this is extremely puzzling. So this is the first puzzle. Why those who worship vidya, why should they go to a greater darkness, end up in a greater darkness? As if into a greater darkness, admittedly, but still. Why does Upanishad say this? In what sense? Second thing that's at least apparently puzzling about this is it concerns the 11th mantra. Because the 11th mantra seems to recommend that even though individually avidya leads to darkness and vidya leads to an even greater darkness, as if in a greater darkness, somehow the combination of the two things leads to the greatest good. It leads to immortality. This is what mantra 11 seems to be saying. If you pursue avidya, you end up in darkness. If you pursue vidya, you end up in a greater darkness. If you combine both, immortality. So there's another cryptic thing. Combining two things which seem to lead to darkness, why should they lead to the highest good? And in what sense are we combining them? And what do these words mean? This is a serious head scratcher for all the commentators. Now, first let's look at how Shankara interprets these very, very difficult mantras. As I mentioned, in the classical Advaitic bag of tricks and tools, one of the most reliable is Adhikari Bheda, the doctrine of differing competencies. And we saw that Shankara invoked the doctrine of Adhikari Bheda in explaining the second mantra, saying that, okay, the first mantra was meant for the highest aspirants, the Jnana Yogis, who should renounce the world and then, realize their true nature as the Atman. The second mantra, because it enjoins action, it cannot be for the same Adhikaris. It has to be for inferior spiritual aspirants. He pulls the same move with respect to mantras 9 through 11. And he says that even though mantra 7, the one we read in the beginning of this class, that's explaining, the realization of Atman. That's for the highest spiritual aspirants. But not 9 through 11. 9 through 11 are addressing inferior aspirants who are not qualified to practice the yoga of knowledge. They are only qualified to practice karma yoga and meditation, upasana. And so this is his interpretation of mantras 9 through 11. Shankara interprets avidya, ignorance, as ritualistic actions, Vedic rites, karma. And he interprets vidya, knowledge, as upasana, meditation, not meditation on Brahman, the highest reality, meditation on devatas, minor deities. And you might ask yourself, what justification does he have for interpreting avidya as karma and vidya as meditation on devatas? That's an open question. And if you're interested, you can read his full commentary and see what kind of justification he gives. And what he claims is that these three mantras denounce the separate practice of either Vedic rites on the one hand or meditation on the devatas, the minor deities, on the other. But in mantra 11, what's recommended is that inferior spiritual aspirants who are not qualified to practice Jnana Yoga should combine both Vedic ritualism and meditation on the devatas in order to attain what? The goal of becoming one with these minor deities. In the original Sanskrit, in Shankara's commentary, is Devata Atma Bhavam, becoming one with the devatas. This is how he interprets Amritam in the 11th mantra, which means immortality. But this immortality is not the highest immortality. It's not the immortality you get from realizing Brahman. It's a kind of relative or temporary immortality of becoming one with a minor deity. It's a kind of station that you occupy for a certain number of years, much longer than a human life. It's very pleasant. And you can lord it over other people and beings. But then ultimately you have to come back. So this is Shankara's interpretation. Now, again, let's see whether we can arrive at a different, possibly more persuasive or more compelling interpretation of the same mantras, 9 through 11, by bringing in the perspective of Sri Ramakrishna. And here, I think, there's one particular teaching that you find in the Kathamrita, in the Gospel, which is very cryptic in its own right. In the Gospel, most of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings are relatively accessible because he speaks in such a simple way, like Jesus did, in the Gospels, in the Bible. But one teaching, this is something that is quite startling. So let me read this. It's in the handout. This is in a conversation with M, the author of the Kathamrita. Sri Ramakrishna says, Rama said, brother, go beyond both knowledge and ignorance. He who has knowledge has ignorance also. If a thorn has entered your foot, get another thorn, and with its help take out the first. Then throw away the second also. M is completely startled. M says, should one throw away both knowledge and ignorance? You can throw away ignorance, but should we also throw away knowledge? Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, that is why one should acquire vijnana. You see, he who is aware of light is also aware of darkness. What is vijnana? It is knowing God in a special way. The realization that God alone has become the universe and all living beings is vijnana. So just notice the parallel between what Sri Ramakrishna is saying and what this Isha Upanishad in mantras 9 to 11 is saying. Because again, in these mantras 9 through 11, you're told that avidya is not desirable, so get rid of it. It leads into a darkness. That's fine. But it also says that those who just focus on vidya, they end up as if in a greater darkness. And Sri Ramakrishna similarly says, remove the thorn of ajnana, agyan in Bangla, with the thorn of jnana, knowledge. Knowledge of what? Knowledge of God, of Brahman. But then throw away both thorns. Throw away the second also. Throw away that knowledge. And then M says, why should we throw away the knowledge? This is crazy. Sri Ramakrishna says, no, there's an even greater state. There's a further state than jnana. It's called vijnana. Throw out both and how do you arrive at vijnana? By using both the thorns, right? One thorn is in the foot, you remove that first thorn with the second thorn of knowledge, and then you throw both away and you arrive at vijnana. And it's the realization that there is only God, this realization of oneness, but it's an all-encompassing oneness. You realize that God has become everything in this world. Now, so this is the way we might think about it. I'm still just talking about Sri Ramakrishna before we move on to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. What does Sri Ramakrishna mean by ajnana? He means ignorance of the ultimate reality, ignorance of God. How do you get rid of it? With knowledge, jnana, gyan in Bangla. What does he mean by jnana? He means brahma jnana. The Advaitic realization that the sole reality is non-dual Brahman, the impersonal Brahman. That's your true nature. Brahma satyam jagat mithya, though. That's important. Remember he said it in the earlier quotation I read? They see this world as a dream. He says, but throw that knowledge away too. After attaining it, it's great. You must attain that knowledge. Then you have to go further. And what is that further state? He calls it vijnana. And this is the realization of Brahma satyam, jagat satyam. Okay? So now, with this in the background, with Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on these two thorns of jnana and vijnana in the background, I think we can better understand Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of mantras 9 through 11. And one thing I should mention, even though if any of you are assiduous students of my classes and attended the first class, you might remember that I started with a passage from Sri Aurobindo where he says that we should interpret the Upanishads from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. But one thing that's striking is in his commentaries on the Upanishads, on the Isha Upanishad, on the Bhagavad Gita, on the Kena Upanishad, he never explicitly refers to Sri Ramakrishna or his teachings anywhere. So it's not obvious, unless you're a very careful student of both Sri Ramakrishna, you understand his teachings and his life, and you're able to understand the depths of Sri Aurobindo's commentary. It's not always obvious how to make the connections between how Sri Aurobindo is interpreting these scriptures and how his interpretation is inspired by the teachings and life of Sri Ramakrishna. So one thing I'm trying to bring out in these classes is making these explicit connections, which he doesn't do himself. So, according to Sri Aurobindo, vidya in mantras 9 through 11 means the consciousness of unity. This is in the handout. And avidya means the consciousness of multiplicity. And then he goes on to say, the perfection of man, therefore, is the full manifestation of the divine in the individual through the supreme accord between vidya and avidya. Multiplicity must become conscious of its oneness. Oneness embrace its multiplicity. This is a very beautiful statement, this last sentence. Multiplicity must become conscious of its oneness. Oneness embrace its multiplicity. So overall, this is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. What he says is, avidya means I'm conscious of the multiplicity in this world. In Sanskrit, it's called nanatva. I see the pews, I see the different human beings in the audience, I see the table, I see the microphone. What do I not see? I don't see God. I see all the different diverse objects in the world, but I don't see God in anything. I'm ignorant of God. Vidya, according to Sri Aurobindo, in this Isha Upanishad 9 through 11, is consciousness of God, of the one Godhead, of unity, but ignoring this multiplicity, not seeing God in the world of multiplicity. So that in Mantra 11, what's recommended is that we combine the consciousness of multiplicity with the consciousness of oneness, of unity, which amounts to the same thing as what Sri Ramakrishna taught, which is combine awareness of the world, which is what ordinary people have, right, who are ignorant of God, awareness of that multiplicity, but combine it with the knowledge of Brahman. And what you end up with is the realization of the Vijnani, that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles, that Brahman has become everything in this world. So mantras 9 through 11 teach the highest ideal of Vijnana in Sri Ramakrishna's sense, according to Sri Aurobindo. Here's another statement he makes in the context of these three mantras, 9 through 11. Sri Aurobindo says, those who are devoted, and this is in the handout, those who are devoted entirely to the principle of indiscriminate unity and seek to put away from them the integrality of the Brahman, also put away from them knowledge and completeness and enter as if into a greater darkness. They enter into some special state and accept it for the whole, mistaking exclusion in consciousness for transcendence in consciousness. This is a very philosophically subtle sentence, and it's worth dwelling over every word. And I want to just bring your attention to a couple aspects of this passage. First of all, he says, what is the problem with just worshiping Vidya, the consciousness of unity? He's thinking of it in terms of two things. One is as the Buddhist realization of shunyata, of a kind of void, completely separate from this world. And the Advaitic realization of non-dual Brahman. Again, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, but excluding this world. And what he says is, what's lost? Why do you end up in as if a greater darkness? Because this whole world goes dark. The world goes dark in that sense. You can't appreciate this multiplicity. Why this multiplicity? Where does it come from? These people who are devoted entirely to the principle of what he calls indiscriminate unity, which means this kind of all-encompassing void or blackness, you know? There's only Brahman in the case of Advaitans, or there's only Shunyata, the void, for some Buddhists. What escapes their notice is the integrality of Brahman, by which he means that Brahman is not just impersonal, but also personal. Brahman is not just static, but also dynamic. Brahman has the capacity to manifest as this world, even though it's also separate from this world and transcendent, beyond this world. That's the integrality that's what he means by the integrality of the Brahman. Brahman is inseparable from Chit Shakti. Sri Aurobindo translates Chit Shakti as consciousness force. And remember, if anyone knows Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, Sri Ramakrishna's one of his favorite teachings was Brahma Shakti Abhed in Bangla, which means Brahman, the Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal Brahman of the classical Advaita Vedantins, is inseparable from Shakti, the dynamic personal God, Kali, the creator of this world, the destroyer of this world. And then look at this last sentence again. He says, these people who just worship unity, so the ones who worship Vidya, they enter into some special state and accept it for the whole, mistaking exclusion in consciousness for transcendence in consciousness. What I think he means is the following. So according to many Advaita Vedantins, and especially post-Shankara Advaita Vedantins, they say that the highest state of the knowledge of non-dual Brahman is attained in a special state called Nirvikalpa Samadhi. It's a state that Sri Ramakrishna describes with a beautiful metaphor. He says that a salt doll goes to measure the depths of an ocean. But as soon as it sets foot in the ocean, it melts in the ocean. So there's nothing. There's just that ocean, right? There's no longer a saltal. There's no individuality anymore. So in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, you lose the sense of individuality, let alone this world, consciousness of the world. There's no consciousness of the world in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. That's why when Sri Ramakrishna was in that state for a long period of time, when he was being trained by Totapuri, one sadhu had to come and force feed him some milk so that he would keep his body. Because he completely lost external consciousness. So what I think Sri Aurobindo means here is that in the Advaitic state of nirvikalpa samadhi and in the Buddhist realization of shunyata or nirvana, you don't perceive the world anymore and you don't perceive a personal God. The mistake that these philosophers make is this is the way that Sri Aurobindo puts it, they mistake exclusion in consciousness for transcendence in consciousness. What I think Sri Aurobindo means here is they generalize a philosophy, they derive a philosophy from this special state of nirvikalpa samadhi, and they say, well, in this state, since I don't perceive the personal God and I don't perceive the world, therefore, the personal God must not exist from the ultimate standpoint, and therefore, this world must not exist from the ultimate standpoint. And Sri Aurobindo is saying, this is a mistake. And this is a mistake emphasized by the Isha Upanishad in mantras 9 through 11, in the context of what the Upanishad calls vidya. You gain a knowledge of unity in the sense of Brahman, the highest reality, but at the expense of the world, of multiplicity. And he says that's the mistake. Just because in one special spiritual state, such as nirvikalpa samadhi, you don't perceive the world, it doesn't mean that the world doesn't exist. This is the main point I think he's making here. So now, this is in my own words, a summary of Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of mantras 9 through 11, if you want catchy formulas. Avidya, in mantras 9 through 11, is the view that Jagat Satyam Brahma Mithya. This world is real, Brahman is unreal. We don't realize God, we don't have any knowledge of God, but we have knowledge of this multiplicity, the pews and the people and the microphones. Vidya is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. It's the highest knowledge according to classical Advaita Vedanta. So both of these lead to a kind of darkness. Avidya leads to darkness because we're in the darkness of ignorance about God. Vidya leads to darkness because the world goes dark. We're not aware of the divinity within this world. And Vijnana is the view that Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. Brahman is true, Brahman is real, and the world is also real. And you arrive at this realization of Vijnana by combining avidya and vidya. And this leads to Amritam, not in the sense of a kind of a relative or a minor or a temporary immortality a la Shankara, that you become one with a minor deity, but this is the highest spiritual fulfillment. This is the ultimate realization of Vijnana. Because you realize that there's nothing but God. What's higher than that? So these are not, as I said, these are not words used by, these are not formula used by Sri Aurobindo. This is my way of summarizing it. And for those of you who are specialists in Sri Aurobindo, before you pounce on me, this is an oversimplification, but one that's nonetheless, I think, helpful for beginners and people who are approaching Sri Aurobindo for the first time. For more nuances in his interpretation of 9 through 11, and for that matter, for the entire Upanishad, please look at his full commentary. It's 100 pages, and obviously I can't give a full, detailed explanation of all the nuances in 3 sittings. And I just wanted to mention one more thing, which was, we discussed this briefly in a previous class, but Swami Turiyanandaji, one of the great direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, his last words, essentially, on his deathbed were Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. So again, I mean, he ended with this realization of Vijnana. And I wanted to mention, so now, I already mentioned Shankara's interpretation of mantras 9 through 11, and then I discussed how a follower of Sri Ramakrishna might interpret the mantra, and how Sri Aurobindo did interpret the mantra in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, even though he doesn't mention Sri Ramakrishna explicitly. I think that the teaching that Sri Aurobindo must have had in mind is this one about the 2 thorns, the thorns of ajnana and jnana, leading to the realization of vijnana. So then you might ask, well, which one should we prefer and why? Why not Shankara's? What makes Sri Aurobindo's or the Ramakrishnan interpretation better, if it is better? And I just want to make a couple suggestions here, that arguably there are 4 advantages of the Ramakrishnan interpretation of mantras 9 through 11 of the Isha Upanishad. First, the first advantage is that Shankara brings in adhikari bheda whenever it's convenient for him, basically. So whenever a mantra says something that doesn't agree with Advaita Vedanta, classical Advaita Vedanta, he says it's for inferior aspirants. So if it teaches karma yoga or bhakti yoga, it's for inferior aspirants. And anytime it teaches jnana yoga, it's for superior aspirants. Now the question is, well, what's the internal textual justification for shifting back and forth between, some mantras addressing inferior aspirants, some mantras addressing superior aspirants? And it's difficult to come up with that kind of justification. So that's the first thing. Sri Aurobindo doesn't bring in adhikari bheda at all. He doesn't say that some of the mantras are addressed to certain people, other mantras are addressed to a completely different audience. You see, he reads the text consistently and in sequence, as all 18 of the mantras are meant for the same people, everybody. It's a universal scripture. Second advantage, arguable advantage, is that the words vidya and avidya don't obviously mean what Shankara claims they mean. Avidya, ignorance, it seems like a stretch to claim that avidya means Vedic rites. I mean, where do you get karma from avidya? It's difficult. I mean, there might be a justification, but it's not obvious what that would be. And vidya, knowledge, it seems to be knowledge of Brahman, as it is in almost all the Upanishads. So why in this case does Shankara say that vidya, no, it's not knowledge of Brahman, it's knowledge of minor deities. And it's not knowledge of minor deities. Knowledge in this sense means meditation. It's actually upasana. It's meditation on the minor deities. Again, the interpretation arguably is strained. And Sri Aurobindo, by contrast, is trying to interpret these words, vidya and avidya, according to their natural meanings. Avidya means ignorance of God, of Brahman. Vidya means knowledge of Brahman, but why does it lead to greater darkness? Because you're ignorant of this world of multiplicity and how God pervades this world of multiplicity. Third advantage concerns the word amritam, immortality, in the 11th mantra. I've already hinted at this, but I'm just going to make this explicit. Shankara, as we saw, has to interpret this immortality as a kind of lower immortality. It's a relative immortality. It's the immortality of becoming temporarily a minor deity, like Hiranyagarbha. But then ultimately we have to come back to a body. So this is not the highest state of spiritual fulfillment. But according to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, this amritam in mantra 11 is the highest spiritual fulfillment, which arguably is more in line with the intention of the rishi who spoke this Isha Upanishad. And the fourth advantage, remember that according to Sri Aurobindo, the overarching theme of the entire Isha Upanishad is the reconciliation of apparent opposites. And these 3 mantras fit beautifully into that framework, because avidya and vidya seem to be apparent opposites. I mean, in a very, very direct and almost violent sense. But that he shows very beautifully how, in fact, they can and should be reconciled with each other. They should be combined in the state of vijnana, by combining consciousness of oneness with the consciousness of multiplicity. So now we can come to the final mantra. Briefly, I'm not going to go into details here, but I didn't want to conclude these classes on the Isha Upanishad without discussing this last very beautiful mantra. Agne naya supatha araye asman vishvani deva vayunani vidvan yuyodhyas majjuhurana meno bhuishtan te nama uktim vidhema. So now, according to Shankara, the Isha Upanishad ends on an anticlimax. Because once again, he says that this last mantra is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants. This last mantra represents the inferior adhikari, the inferior spiritual aspirant's dying wish to attain temporary oneness with the minor deity Hiranyagarbha. And more generally, so just to give you more of a bird's eye view of how Shankara interprets this Upanishad as a whole, Shankara says that only the first mantra and mantras 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, so a total of 7 mantras, addresses superior spiritual aspirants who are qualified to practice Jnana Yoga. And all of the other mantras in this Upanishad, which means 2, the second mantra, Kurvan Neveya Karmani, and 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, all addressed to inferior spiritual aspirants. This is how Shankara interprets the structure of the Isha Upanishad, and I'll leave it up to you to discuss and think about whether that's persuasive or not. And so the very last mantra, which should be the kind of culmination of the thought of the Upanishad, becomes another sort of it's like, as I said, an anticlimax. It's just, I want to become one with the minor deity. This is the prayer, according to Shankara. Okay, now, briefly, how does Sri Aurobindo interpret the same mantra? He interprets it in the light of the previous mantras. And as we've already seen, he says that this Upanishad is teaching again and again the highest ideal of Vijnana in Sri Ramakrishna's sense, seeing everything as God, seeing God in everything, even yourself as God. That's the Advaita that this Isha Upanishad is teaching, what he calls a synthetic or comprehensive monism. And in that context, he says that this mantra is addressing Agni. That's why the first word is Agne. You're directly addressing Agni here. But what is Agni? This is a difficult question. And again, different commentators have interpreted Agni in different ways. To understand more deeply how Sri Aurobindo understands Agni, you'd have to look at another book he wrote on the Vedas, the Vedic hymns, called The Secret of the Veda, where he argues that Agni and these other terms like Surya, which according to Purva Mimamsa and even Uttara Mimamsa, Vedanta, these are generally understood to be minor deities. Agni is the god of fire, and Surya is the god of the sun. Sri Aurobindo says, no, there's a deeper mystical meaning behind all of these. And they're all just different aspects of the same infinite divine reality, actually. So actually, Agni is what he calls Chit Shakti, what I've already mentioned, he calls consciousness force, Chit Shakti. He describes it beautifully on page 77 of his commentary on the Isha Upanishad as the flame of the divine will. So according to Sri Aurobindo, the ultimate reality is Sat Chit Ananda, but that Chit is Chit Shakti. So that Sat Chit Ananda has the inherent capacity to manifest as this world. And so Agni is Chit Shakti. It's the dynamic aspect of the divine reality. And so in this last mantra, we're praying directly to Shakti, who Sri Ramakrishna called Kali. What are we praying for? The final mantra is a prayer to Shakti for the highest spiritual illumination. And the means to achieving this highest illumination is bhakti, and specifically surrender to the divine will. Where do we find that? Because in the second line of this last mantra, we get, first of all, a prayer, Yuyodhi asmat juhuranameno. O Mother, Divine Mother, O Shakti, please prevent me from going into the crooked paths of sin. And then, Bhuyishtamte nama uktim vidhema. Again and again, I offer my salutations to you. I give my entire being to you, mind, body, and soul. That's how the Upanishad ends, actually, on a note of surrender to the divine. So I'll leave it there because I'm sure that you guys have many questions. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. First, Dhruva, and then.
So I'm gonna have to mix in another teaching to kind of get the idea of God across. So, like how Thakur explained that, like Dvaita, Vishishta Dvaita, and Advaita were just like progressive.
Thakur never taught that. Swami Vivekananda did.
That was Swamiji, okay, excuse me, who taught that was like a progressive state of spirituality. Could it be said that, Jnana and then Vijnana are progressive, and in which case is there going to be another manifestation that's going to come and say, okay, there's a state higher than Vijnana?
It's an interesting question. Is there a state higher than Vijnana? See, one thing that you have to keep in mind about Sri Ramakrishna, now, I mean, let's not focus on Swami Vivekananda, but on Sri Ramakrishna. He never said that the Vijnani has a completely comprehensive knowledge of God. What he says is that the Vijnani has a more expansive knowledge of God than the Jnani, who only realizes the impersonal aspect, which is called Brahman, or bhaktas, most bhaktas, who realize God in a particular form of the personal God, whether it's Krishna or Kali or Shiva. Why is the Vijnani's realization more expansive? In the sense that the Vijnani, he or she realizes that God is both personal and impersonal. Vijnani dekhe jini nirgun tini shogun. That's Sri Ramakrishna's exact language. The Vijnani sees that divine reality, which is nirguna, is also saguna. At the same time, he uses that beautiful metaphor of the ant and the sugar hill. So an ant goes to this giant hill of sugar, takes one grain of the sugar, becomes cocky, and says, next time I go to the hill, I'm going to take the whole hill. And Sri Ramakrishna laughs and says, that's how some people think. But nobody can understand or know the whole of God. Nobody, including the Vijnani. This is how I take it. So it's not that the Vijnani has a complete knowledge of God. God alone has a complete knowledge of God. That's how I see it. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for these lectures. Really great, really enjoyed them, very clear arguments. All this seems to be advocating for at least as thinking and acting as if everything exists as real.
And as God, that's important.
And as God.
Because everybody thinks the world is real, right?
Right,
Ordinary people.
I was going to mention
but they don't see
we do
God.
that already, but even after realization, we would do so as well with a little caveat there of also seeing God and everything. Exactly. But I question how really the two different Advaita interpretations are different, contingent on the word real and the definition of the word real. Most would interpret or define it as not illusory. So meaning what we see exists as we see it. Right? What we perceive exists as we see it. But if that were the definition, I feel like the traditional or Shankara Advaita interpretation is the most philosophically sound in that we know what we see, even just in modern philosophy, we know what we see is not real as it is. We know there's the atomic level, subatomic level, everything we see. Animals see that same clay pot differently than the way we see it. So whose perception is more vertical? Right? You know, how do you define it? So that's why I like the illusory interpretation, because we can get an idea of how everything we perceive is illusory at this level, and then has that more deeper ultimate reality.
Of course, the ultimate reality according to physics is very different from the ultimate reality according to Shankara.
We take it one step further.
Well, one step is many steps, right? But So, I mean, I don't know many physicists who deny the reality of this world. They just say that the world isn't ultimately the way we perceive it. You can say Shankara says the same thing, right? The world is actually Brahman, and these names and forms are illusory. So the key here is, this is maybe the best way to answer your question. I'm going to try at least. What is the ontological status of the names and forms? This is a very precise question. The names and forms, the pews, the glass, the table, the book, the laptop, these are all names and forms, right? What is the ontological status of these things according to these two different forms of Advaita philosophy? Are these names and forms real or unreal? And according to Shankara's classical Advaita, they're unreal. And according to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, Swami Vivekananda's integral Advaita, and Sri Aurobindo's integral Advaita, the names and forms themselves are real manifestations, or what Vivekananda called variations of the one divine. That to me is the crucial difference between the two kinds of Advaita. Thanks.
I think of it in terms of the pews they're impermanent, because you can chop the wood up, and then you can burn it, and then it can become ash, and then it can go in the water and become something else. So the name and form are not real, but
whoa! I mean, that's a quick jump. I mean, you're saying they're impermanent, but then that's exactly
they're impermanent. They're impermanent, but matter. Well, I guess energy cannot be created or destroyed. No,
it's the same thing. It's just wood. I mean, it goes back to the same wood when you chop it up, and it's.
So the illusion is at levels, and we know that even in the human body, every 7 years, every cell is different, right? And it's.
Yeah, but the question is, while it's there, is it real?
Well, because it can transform, but it cannot eliminate itself from the universe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I was thinking about the word Agni Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that I am the digestive fire in the stomach.
Aham Vaishvanaro Bhutva.
And that's what transforms food into energy in the human body. So that's one thought I had. I don't know how that relates to this, but I just wanted to share that.
It helps digestion, yeah. God can help us with our... It's like an antacid.
So that sort of adds to what Aurobindo said, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
The other question I have is that the word vidya is different from jnana. Vidya is knowledge, and knowledge can be experiential or textbookish. And jnana is knowledge which is true for me.
It just depends. I mean, there are different people who interpret jnana in different ways. Even Shankara interprets jnana sometimes as the highest spiritual realization.
Yeah, or Vigyan, for example, is experiential reality, right? What I have experienced to be true.
Yeah, but jnana is often means the same thing. It really depends on... We can't make generalizations about these terms, like make blanket statements that jnana always means this or jnana. That would be problematic. Because in the Upanishads, in many places, jnana seems to mean the highest knowledge.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. But vidya and jnana have not been used interchangeably.
Often
or
they
have
are.
They?
Yeah, they seem to be.
Okay,
They both just mean knowledge. I mean that...
Okay, in my mind, I'm thinking of vidya as knowledge, but in the abstract, and jnana and vigyan.
That's one possible interpretation, but it would be hard to justify that on the basis of the scriptures, that there's some hard and fast difference.
Yeah, I don't know enough. I'm just...
Yeah, so he's thinking of... Maharaj, Swami Medhananda is mentioning this Mundak Upanishad mantra, which is about... There are two kinds of vidya, aparavidya and paravidya. This is a good way... Yeah, actually, it helps to answer your... Yeah. So here... what you're thinking of merely kind of scriptural knowledge would be this aparavidya. And paravidya is spiritual realization. It's that through which we realize Brahman, basically.
Okay, that's really
So
helpful.
vidya can also be spiritual realization. Jnana can also be spiritual realization.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Thanks.
So I think you've come across this question before. If you give so much reality to everything in the world, then how do you answer the question of evil? Unless you just...
Of what?
Of evil.
I think unfortunately you missed the last class last week.
But I listened to the YouTube.
Did you watch it? Okay, because
though.
see the first mantra's second line, it addresses this directly, right? It says, renounce egoism and desire in order to truly enjoy this world as a true manifestation of God.
No, not ego. I said evil.
E-V-I-L.
E-V-I-L.
Evil.
I see. Okay, so sorry, what's the question?
Yeah, so if you give so much reality, if you say everything is real in this world and it's God that inhabits each and everything, then how does one answer the
problem of evil?
The problem of evil.
Yeah, okay, that's great. That's a great question. So yeah, I mean, how do you... Within this framework of Vijnana Vedanta, or how we're interpreting this life-affirming Advaita Vedanta, how do you reconcile the fact of an omnipotent and all-loving God and a compassionate God with the fact that there's just pervasive suffering? There's the Ukraine war, there are a million things going on. There's killing and suffering. So Maharaj says evil is less divinity manifested. So there are different interpretations. I've done a lot of scholarly work on this issue, and so if you're interested, you can look at my chapter 7 and 8 of my previous book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. Both those chapters are devoted to Sri Ramakrishna's solution of the problem of evil. And then I have a separate article on Sri Aurobindo's response to the problem of evil. But the main idea is this. I think that according to Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, the evil is perfectly real. But it has a purpose in the overall divine scheme of things. That purpose is, in one place in the gospel, somebody asks Sri Ramakrishna this question directly. Why is there so much suffering in this world? Why so much death and this and that? God could have made a better, more pleasant world, after all. Sri Ramakrishna said, yes, it's true that things like lust and greed are evil qualities that lead to all sorts of suffering, untold suffering over eons. Why does God permit it? Mohat lok toyer korbin bole. In order to create saints. This is a very important statement. He says that it's through the process of experiencing both happiness and suffering and encountering the evil, both in this world and in ourselves. Every one of us has evil qualities until we realize God. It's through those experiences and looking at the effects and the consequences of indulging in those in committing evil that we can improve, we can grow and evolve morally and spiritually, until each one of us will eventually attain the highest goal of God realization. Because Sri Ramakrishna believed in universal salvation, not a single soul will be lost. Every single soul will eventually attain the highest goal of life, which is God realization. Not everybody in this physical embodiment, but eventually. If not in this life, then in a future life. And it's through the experience of both both good and evil that we can evolve morally and spiritually. And so that means that this doctrine of spiritual evolution also presupposes two other crucial doctrines, the doctrine of karma and the doctrine of rebirth. Every single thing we do, any evil I commit is going to have karmic consequences for myself and for others. We might think that in this world, well, a lot of evildoers seem to be getting away scot-free. How did, Hitler didn't seem to, at the end, Hitler didn't lead, have the best life. But in any case, he probably deserved a lot worse. But we don't see what happened to him later, after he left his body in this life, right? So it's important to keep in mind that this is a many lives scheme, and that the doctrine of karma is infallible.
But then you're mixing up the two levels of reality, right? The absolute and the empirical. So
I don't think Sri Ramakrishna even brings in those two levels. He never talks about Vyavaharika and Paramatika Satta.
But when you say God inhabits everything, right? Is God...
God is everything.
Or God is everything.
Yeah.
Then
God is the evil also.
Then the evil...
God is
God,
the evil.
right?
There's a beautiful... I think you have to
not an evolution of any sort.
There's an evolution for us, right? Who are also different manifestations of God. It's all, this entire world is God's play.
I think that's what answers to me in my own head, that this is just a play. Because
but just a play is tricky because, again, it might make God out to be a kind of sadistic 5-year-old. What kind of play is it? There are children who love tearing apart ants and, is this God? This is kind of terrifying. Mm-hmm. So there has to be something, a divine purpose behind the play. And the purpose is explained via the doctrine of spiritual evolution, grounded in the doctrines of karma, rebirth, and universal salvation. That's at least my interpretation.
Thank you.
Isn't evil also Isn't evil also manifestation of extreme form of ignorance? That the more you see division, separation from others, then you cause harm, or sometimes you're indifferent, and the more
you're right.
you are.
But I think she agrees with that. It's just what she's saying is, but even that is God. Yeah. That's where the discordance comes in our minds. If everything is God, that means all the horrible things that are happening in the world are also God. Right. So how do we explain it, right? So you're right. It's just, that doesn't actually go against what we've been saying.
It's also kind of like a riddle. Like, you have evil, you have good, and you just have to navigate through it, through all these, to reach, like you said, the ultimate. Because many people who wouldn't even consider it, they're fine. But people who have seen both, they said, good and evil, I have to see what is the absolute.
I don't think anybody exists who has only encountered good and no evil. I don't believe that person exists. I think everybody's life is a combination of good and bad. And, that's how we grow and that's how we learn, it seems to me.
I think on a simplistic level, from the 9 through 11, I think that's what it's trying to say, is that you have to go beyond the ignorance and the vidya, beyond the good and the evil. You have to transcend the opposites. I was thinking about it before I read any of the commentaries. And in my mind it said, you have to go beyond these opposites.
That's possible. As I said, there are many, many interpretations. The challenge for you would be to justify on a textual basis, interpreting vidya as good and avidya as evil. That's not obvious as an interpretation. You might say more generally as the opposites, but then again, you'd have to justify that and say, well, why use the terms vidya and avidya? Why not say dvandva, which is what's used in the Gita, for instance, and other nidvandvo, himahabaho, So it's tricky. Every interpretation is controversial. And I certainly don't want to come off as saying that Sri Aurobindo must be right and everybody else is wrong. That's not. I'm presenting you with different interpretations. And I want each of you to think for yourselves.
There's a few online questions. First, is there permanent moksha? Because all spiritual practice seems to be of cleansing of perception, when perception can become clear or unclear based on condition of the mind.
Yeah, the question is rooted in the assumption that we're in a body, in a physical body. with the mind. But the whole point of ultimate salvation is that when we leave the body, after we exhaust the karma of our last embodiment, assuming that we've attained liberation, then once we exit the body, and here, again, it depends on which tradition of Hinduism you're asking the question from the standpoint of. But let me explain Sri Ramakrishna's position, as far as I've understood it. He says that there are two different forms of salvation, depending on what you prefer and what kind of sadhana you performed. Bhaktas generally want salvation in the form of dwelling in an eternal heaven with the personal God, so they can serve this God in a loving relationship. That's what Vrajaloka is according to Vaishnavism. That's what the Christian heaven is. That's what the Islamic heaven is. So that's what Ramakrishna Loka is for Bhaktas of Sri Ramakrishna, for instance. And it's real. And it's not that it's ultimately superseded by some higher kind of salvation. At the same time, for those who don't want that, who don't care to come or go anywhere, who don't want to maintain their individuality in order to relish the love of God, for those, in other words, who want to become sugar rather than to eat sugar, salvation for those people, those souls, Advaita Vedantins, some Buddhists, takes an entirely different form. It's just resting in your true nature as Brahman, like the salt melting in the ocean. So there are two different paradigms for salvation, both of which are equally valuable and equally ultimate. And it's really a matter of preference.
So one person asked like 4 questions, so maybe I should just read one of them?
Pick the best.
Okay.
According to your own judgment. I trust you.
Okay. What is meant by Advaitic I am Brahman? Does it mean that in essence I am of the same composition as Brahman, or does it mean that I am Brahman myself, and does Advaita accurately interprets Upanishadic Mahavakyas, or would Vijnana Vedanta would be a better tool for the task? Okay,
well, it's an interesting question, but it'll take me too long to really discuss this at length. But what do the Mahavakyas mean? Aham Brahmasmi, for instance, I am Brahman. According to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, it means I am non-dual pure consciousness in my deepest essence. And Sri Ramakrishna agrees 100%. There's no difference there. The difference comes in the status of Shakti and the status of this world, and the status of the different individual souls. And according to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, all those are also real manifestations of the same God. Because God has both the impersonal aspect as pure consciousness and the personal aspect as Shakti, or the personal God, which manifests as everything. So I think that's a short answer. And how could we interpret the Mahavakyas from the standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta? We can fully embrace the classical Advaitic interpretation of the Mahavakya, which is that you really are, in your deepest essence, non-dual pure consciousness, exactly in the way that Sarvapriyananda lectures about all the time. At the same time, there's also a real personal God, which you can call Shakti or Kali or whatever you want, which is inseparable from Brahman. That's why Sri Ramakrishna would teach again and again, Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. And so, from that standpoint, you can also interpret Aham Brahmasmi. So Ramanuja and Madhva have interpreted the same Mahavakyas in completely different ways. So followers of Ramanuja can interpret it as, I am a servant of God, I am an amsha of God, a portion of God, and that's also true. That's the beauty of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. He used the example of Hanuman. Hanuman said, so long as I identify with this physical body, I say, O Rama, I am your servant. When I identify with my individual soul, the Jivatman, then I say, I am an amsha of you, I'm a part of you, a spark of you. And when I have knowledge of my deepest essence, I say, I am you and you are me. Aham Brahmasmi. And Sri Ramakrishna says, in one place in the Gospel, very significantly, he says, this is my final and mature opinion. And then he goes and quotes the Hanuman shloka, which means this is the Vijnani state. The beauty of the Vijnani, he uses another example, Sri Ramakrishna. He says, why should I play only one note on the flute? I want to play ragas and raginis, playing beautiful tunes on this flute, which means what? It means I want to commune with God at different levels of consciousness. I want to be the servant, the lover, the friend, the parent, the child. All of it's real. That's the beauty of Vijnana Vedanta. Satya, I think you had you can do the honors for the last question. Yeah. Yes, you can give him the mic. I think that'll be. Yeah.
So liberation for the Jnani would be the absolute Brahman, and then for the Bhakta, in that sense, would be with forms. So the liberation for the Vijnani, I'm just assuming, would be that he would be able to enjoy both. formless Brahman and with forms? Or
well,
no?
okay, that's a good question. But I mean, the thing about the Vijnani is there's a catch here. Sri Ramakrishna once said, I'll never get liberation. What do you mean? He's Avatara. He's God himself. And God is tirelessly working for the welfare of humanity. And so Sri Ramakrishna used to say that Vijnani, only Ishvara Kotis are capable of attaining the state of Vijnana, generally. He would distinguish Jiva Kotis and Ishvara Kotis. Jiva Kotis are ordinary souls. Those are people who, through a great deal of sadhana over the course of many lives, they can finally attain Brahmajnana. They leave their body and they breathe a sigh of relief and they go to, they either merge in Brahman or they stay in some heaven. That's an ordinary soul. And he likens them to a little piece of driftwood floating on the river, and if even one small bird sits on it, it'll sink into the water. And he says, Vijnanas are like giant aircraft carriers. He doesn't use aircraft carriers, that's a later modern, but it's like that. A huge thing that can take across, it's like Noah's Ark with all sorts of things. What does it mean? It means the Vijnani will come back again and again to help humanity.
So if you're in a Christian heaven or in a Ramakrishna loka, then you cannot merge in Brahman and come back to it, or you have
to... I think according to Sri Ramakrishna, the idea is that if you want, go ahead. That's the beauty of it. It's about eating sugar or becoming sugar. It's what you want. And if you're tired of it after some time, of this heaven, merge in Brahman, no problem.
Will be able to come back again or no?
Look, I haven't attained salvation, so... we'll talk later. We'll compare notes. Any other online questions, or?
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
Could one reach Vijnana without first attaining Shankara's jnana? For example, could a bhakta who has thoroughly realized reach Vijnana?
Oh, can you repeat the question so that for the audience, yeah.
Once more. Could one reach Vijnana without first attaining Shankara's jnana? For example, could a bhakta who has thoroughly realized reach Vijnana?
Yeah, that's another good question. So here's how I think Sri Ramakrishna would answer the question. What he would say is, if you practice the path of bhakti, by God's grace, the bhakta can also attain Brahmajnana. So you don't have to sort of stop practicing bhakti and then, now I'm going to be a jnana yogi. I am now an adhikari, a superior spiritual aspirant. Now I'm going to practice the yoga of knowledge and then I'm going to realize Brahma. He says, no, it's not like that, because God is all powerful and he's all compassionate. And so if a bhakta desperately wants Brahmajnana, God will give Brahmajnana to him. And he gives the example of a king who, if a servant of a king on his own just jumps up and sits on the throne of the king's not going to be pleased. But if out of love the king says, come here, my dear, you sit where I'm sitting, and then takes him on his lap, or he moves away and then he puts him, that's okay. So that's the analogy, is that by God's grace anything is possible, and that God can also grant the bhakta, the highest knowledge of non-dual Brahman. And the first part of the question was, so does the Vijnani have to attain jnana in Shankara's sense? Yes, he does. I mean, Sri Ramakrishna says it explicitly. That's what, you leave the steps behind one by one and you reach the roof. The roof is Advaitic Brahmajnana. But the caveat here is, that doesn't mean you have to stop practicing bhakti and then practice jnana yoga, which is Shankara's view. Sri Ramakrishna says, even bhaktas just practicing bhakti, by God's grace you can attain Brahmajnana, and by God's grace you can also go further and attain the state of Vijnana. All right, thank you so much. Excellent questions, and thank you for attending. Any other last minute questions? I think we can wrap it up. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.